What happens if you need to do some content modeling inside of Contentful CMS? However, the out-of-the-box components, they don't quite do what you need them to do. Now, one option is obviously to change your requirements. However, boss-level developers, they'll create custom backend UI extensions for Contentful. Now, doing this isn't too hard, and if you want to learn how to, then this is a must-watch video for you. Now, in this video, I'm going to walk you through how to create a real-world enhancement to the slug component that you can use in your own CMS projects. However, along the journey, I will teach you everything you need to do in order to create any type of custom app possible. So if that sounds good to you, then don't forget to very lightly click on that like button and that subscribe button. And now let's get on with the good stuff. Okay, so the plan for this video is for me to walk you step by step on how to create a custom backend app within Contentful. Now, the app we're going to build today is going to be an enhancement to this slug component. So just in case you weren't aware, if you want to allow content editors to add URLs, you'd use this slug component. It's not really that clever. It's just basically a text box with a little icon at the front. Now, the enhancement that we're going to make to this component is here. So what we're going to do is, as we're adding in our URL, you can see at the top, you're actually going to get the end website URL. So we can copy and paste it. We can get a good idea of what it looks like. And then underneath, we're also going to add in this generate bit.ly URL button. So when we click on this, we're going to get the shortcut URL for it that we're going to generate via bit.ly. Now, in order for you to build this custom app yourself, there's going to be a few steps that you're going to have to follow. Now, one of those steps is actually writing all the code and building the app. The second bit is installing that app in Contentful. And then the third bit is dealing with global settings within the CMS itself. So I'm going to walk you through all of those little steps. And the first thing we need to think about is how do we actually build the code files? And in order to do this, we're going to have to make use of two really handy resources. The first useful resource that you need to know about is called Forma36. Now, you can access this resource online at f36.contentful.com. And the Forma36 framework is basically a combination of Figma UI kit mixed with a bunch of React components. Now, the benefit of using Forma36 to build your back-end extension or app is that you can import a bunch of components. They're going to be styled in the Contentful styling, and you can make use of it without having to reinvent the wheel yourself. So now, if you're wondering what type of components you get access to, in essence, you get around 30 or 40 different components. So as you can see, we've got an accordion, we've got things like badges, we've got buttons, we've got cards, we've got form components, text areas, text inputs, there's headers, there's icons, there's images, there's lists, there's menus, there's notifications, paginations, pills, popovers, tooltips, typography. There's so much here that you can pretty much build any backend component you want and make use of this very easily. Now, Forma36 is definitely going to make it much quicker and easier for you to create your custom app. However, Forma36 isn't going to generate the code required by Contentful to run your app in a CMS. Now, the good news here is that instead of you having to create everything yourself, instead you can install this framework called Create Contentful App, created by Contentful, as you'd expect. And this project, once run, can generate all the project, the code, and everything required by Contentful to build your app. After you have installed Create Contentful App using npm, yarn, whatever it might be, the next step is to generate our app files. And you can do that by firing up a terminal and then doing a command like a npx at contentful/create-contentful-app. Running this command is going to start a wizard, and the first param we need to supply here is your app name. So let's say I want to call this John Contentful App, and obviously this can be whatever you want it to be. Now, the next thing we need to supply is, do we want to generate a blank file? So this is the template option, and from here we can use things like JavaScript or TypeScript. Alternatively, if you're not sure what's going on, we can actually elect to install an example template instead. So we've got some pre-built stuff here, things like a validator, custom entry comparers, a DAM, default values. So there's some good stuff in here if you just want to learn a bit more about how to get going with App Framework. So taking your newly generated files and folder, open it up inside Visual Studio Code, and you'll be presented with a folder structure which looks a bit like this. Now, the good news is there's nothing too scary here because this project structure is pretty simple. In essence, we've got this source folder where we're going to put our code files. And you can see in mine, I've got a components folder, I've got a locations folder, and an app and index component. And I'll cover this in more detail in a little bit. Now, if we look at our package.json, you can see that all the dependencies have been managed for us. So we've got the Contentful app framework SDK installed. We've got F36 components installed. And I've also installed this field editor slug. Now, I'll cover this later on, but just to point out, I have installed something additional here. Now, if we look within our scripts, we can see we've got a start script, and we can use this for debugging stuff. We've got a create app definition, and this command is going to generate all of our scripts for us that will be required to use our app within Contentful. We can also see we've got this upload option, so we can actually deploy our scripts into Contentful, saving us a little bit of time. Cool. So we've now got this project which will allow us to flesh out our app. However, there's one small thing we need to consider before we can start writing code, and that is how we're going to view and debug our app in real time as we're creating it. Now, the best way to start viewing and debugging our app is to install it inside of Contentful and use its debugging feature so we can update things within the CMS as we're coding along. So to create and install your custom app, log into the CMS, and then within this apps drop down, you want to go to the custom app option. Clicking on this, in the top right corner here, you can see manage app definition. Click on that, and then from here, you can see the option to create an app. Now, when you click on that, you're going to see a settings screen, which looks like this. And then within here, you're going to add in your app details. So you can give your app a name. I'm going to call mine the link generator. You can give an icon. And then the important thing for development is in here, you can give your front end URL. And just in case you're not sure what this URL is going to be, the default URL for the Create Contentful app is going to be localhost 3000. Now, after you've added that debug URL, your next step is to decide where your app should display inside the CMS itself. So this is where we've got the location panel here. You can see we have a few options. Now, for my specific use case, I will need to overwrite a content field editor. So I'll be using this option here. However, it's worth pointing out that we can also replace a sidebar item, an entry editor, a dialog window, a separate page, an app homepage, or a config screen. So there's lots of good stuff here. And if you want to learn more, head over to the Contentful docs so you can learn all about it here. So jumping back to our config screen, I need to tick this. And then the next thing I need to do is decide the field type I want to override. So for my example, the slug uses the short text. So I need to tick this one. Now, aside from these options, you can see that I've also got the ability to upload a bundle. So this is how we can host our final production app when it's finished. After that, we've got security, so we can define who can see it. We can define some key value pairs. We've got some event handling, some actions. And we've got the ability to do some functions as well. Now, after you've created your app, if I go back to my space, what you'll notice is now if I go to apps and then I go to custom apps, you can see that I've got the option of installing my custom app here on a per space basis. Now, after you've installed your app, the next thing is to apply it to a bit of content. So if I go to this blog post in my content model tab here, you can see that I've added in a slug already, and my field type for the slug is short text. So remember, we set that in our app definition. Now, if I click on the edit button here, if I go down to appearance, you can see that I've changed the appearance to use my link generator app. So now we're using our custom UI rather than the default slug one, which is over here. So after we do that, click save. If I go to my content, if I open up something of type blog post, you can see that I'm now using this custom UI here. And this is all we need to do in order to preview things. Because now if I want to make dev changes, as long as my local development server is up and running, you'll be able to see your changes within Contentful so you can start writing and debugging things to your heart's content. Now, I'm well aware that trying to copy code from screen is a pain in the bottom. That's why that if you want to explore everything we're covering in this video, I recommend heading over to my GitHub, which is github.com/johndjones-poc. If you go to repositories, if you scroll down, you'll find this Contentful bit.ly slug app framework example, so you can clone this rather than trying to copy the code I'm about to go through. we are now ready to start coding up our custom app. And before we get there, let's quickly understand how our component's going to get called. So looking at our project here, the entry point into our app is this index.tsx. Now looking in here, there's nothing really clever here. We're basically importing global styles from F36 components. So we've got our style sheets, and we've got the SDK provider from React Apps Toolkit, and then our app framework basically looks like our SDK provider and the global styles, and then our app. Now, if we look within app.tsx, the important thing to note here is that we've got this component location settings. So you can see here, we've got a key value pair. We've got location underscore entry underscore field, and we've got location underscore app underscore config. So hopefully it's a little bit more clear why I showed you this page a minute ago, because if you want to create a custom app yourself, you're going to have to use one of these locations in your code in order to make sure the right component gets loaded. So with that array defined, if we look at the main code within the app, you can see all we're doing is getting that array, we're mapping it to this SDK.location, and then if we have a match, we're basically going to load our component. Otherwise, we're going to get an error. Now I'm going to cover this line shortly, but you can see here that within this hook, so from React Apps Toolkit, we've got use SDK. This is how we can access and interact with App Framework in Contentful. Now, if we quickly look back within this component array, you can see that whenever location underscore entry underscore field is triggered, we're then going to call this field component. And if we look at field, you can see that we're getting it from locations/field. So that means that in my example, I need to add my field component here. And this is the file, this is the function, which is going to do all the magic and render that property on page. So basically this return here, down here, this is the thing which is being displayed within Contentful. Now, the thing you'll notice here is that I'm using this text input, a slug editor, a button, and a form control. And again, you probably guessed it, but these are all coming from F36. So F36 components. So the button is that bit.ly button that you saw, which will generate the URL. The text input is where the long website URL is going to be added into. And a form, well, it's a form, isn't it? Now, at the beginning, I teased that I was importing an additional component, the slug editor. So let's quickly look at what this is and how you can import it yourself. Okay, so it's probably first worth mentioning that this is only relevant if you want to override the field editors. And if you're installing your app in a different location, you might not need to do this. But it's worth knowing that Contentful, if you head over to github/contentful/field-editors, they provide you with all the out-of-the-box editors. So in here, you can see we've got single line editors, multi-line, drop-downs, tags, lists, checkbox, radio, booleans, JSON, dates, slug. And if I go to the package bit here within the repo, you'll see that each component we can add has got its own folder. So let's say that I click on the rating one. You'll see that within here, if I look in the README, we can install it via npm, and we've got the install instruction here. It also shows you how you can import it. So the one that I want to use in this example is the slug. So if I click on this, if I go to the README, you can see how we can install it. And then if I jump over to my package.json, you can see that I've imported it here. And then if I look within my fields, you can see that this is how I render it on page. Now, if I jump back to Contentful, you can see that this is how I'm rendering this slug property within my custom app. So now that we've got a way to render the exact slug component within our custom app, the next thing is to actually interact with Contentful and get the data we need added by content editors. So in order to do that, you need to look at these two lines. So the first thing here, we've got this field app SDK from Contentful/app-SDK. And this is mainly because we're working with TypeScript. And the important bit is this use SDK hook from @contentful/react-apps-toolkit. Now, underneath here, we've got some hooks here, and this is custom stuff for this component. But the real thing that you're going to need to do pretty much in every one of your custom apps is this line here. So we can see that we're using the SDK, and because we're using TypeScript, we're passing in this field app SDK. So this is going to define all the different fields and the properties and everything we can do within this SDK method. So basically, if you're trying to create an app in a different location, let's say a setting, you can see here we've got the config app SDK. We've got other different SDKs in here like the dialog app SDK. So basically you need to import the thing relevant to the area you're working in and then new up your SDK like this. Now, after we've got our SDK, you can see that I can do a .parameters.installation. So this is going to give us access to some settings. I'm going to cover settings shortly. However, just in case you're curious, those two variables reference these two form fields within my global configuration screen. Now, aside from this parameters object on SDK, you're also going to get access to a window object. So these two lines here basically make sure that our custom UI looks okay. So I've jumped us back into the CMS and refreshed the page, and you can see now that we've got a scroll bar here. And actually, if we want to view our property, we're going to have to scroll this up and down to be able to see all the different functionality. Now, the reason why we get that overflow is because the UI we're building here doesn't fit into the default UI space. So again, this is where we do the start auto resizer and the update height. Now that we've got our UI looking okay, we can start to think about how do we read and write the data added by the content editor within the CMS for our property. Now, in order to access our data, we can use this field prop here. So sdk.field. And in order to read the data added by the content editor, you can do an sdk.field.getValue. Now, if you want to write data back to the CMS, you can also do a set value, and then you can just pass in the data you want to associate with the property as the function argument here. Now, aside from this, we've also got the ability to listen into when these values are changed. So you can see here, I'm doing a callback function on this event, so on value changed. So what we're saying here is sdk.field.onValueChanged, and you can see that when our property is updated, we're going to read it. We're then going to combine it with this global property that I'll cover in a minute, and then I'm going to store it locally so we can display it. Now, if we carry on down to the display here, you can see in my slug editor that we need to set the base SDK, and we're passing in the SDK method here. And then when we want to render a property, I'm just doing sdk.field. So this is pretty important because passing in these two bits of data and being able to listen to the event handler here and get values, this is how that read-write process is working. So that's covered all the Contentful specific operations that this custom component is performing. The only other thing that I haven't really shown you is how we're generating that bit.ly URL. So if I scroll down to the return here, you can see that we've got a button, and then you can see here I've got an on click, which is a handle submit. Then just above this, you can see I've got this bit.ly URL here. Now, if I scroll up, you can see that I've defined this handle submit async function. In here, I'm just doing the classic form stuff, so prevent default. And then underneath here, I'm just doing a classic fetch. I'm using the bit.ly API. I'm passing in an authorization API key, which we need to add into a global setting in a second. And then underneath here, we're just getting the API result, turning it into JSON, and then setting that bit.ly URL using a hook. And that's pretty much all this component's doing. So hopefully you can see that building these backend extensions, nothing really to worry about. It's pretty similar to building any other component. The only big difference is we're using the App Framework SDK. Now, the only thing we're yet to hook up is how do we access those global settings. So let's look at that now. The first step to enabling our extra config screen is to update our app definition. So remember, we can do this in apps, custom apps. From here, we're going to go to manage definition. And then from here, I'm going to click on my link generator. So within our locations, we need to make sure the app configuration screen is now ticked. Once we do this, what should happen and everything's set up correctly is that if we go back to our space, if I go to my custom app now, you can see that this configure button is available. If I click on this, you can now see that we've got our configuration screen loading, and on here I've got a form and it's got two components. So the first text component here will allow me to add in a pod website URL, and the second one is my bit.ly API key. We're now back inside our project, and I'm in the app.tsx, and just a reminder, we've got this locations.location_app_config, and it's pointing to this config screen component, which is located in locations. So if I open this up, let's have a look what's going on here. So at the top, like pretty much all our other UI components, we're getting some stuff from the F36 components. And we're also needing to use my use SDK here. Now, this time, because we're working with app config and because we're using TypeScript, we need to use this config app SDK type definitions. Now, if I look at my return, you can see that we've just got a standard form. It's got two form controls, and I'm adding in parameters.url here for the URL and parameters.api key to get the bit.ly API key. And then on change, you can see that we're doing set parameters, and I'm passing in my parameters here. And this is how we're doing our read write for our global configuration screen. Okay, so now that you've seen the HTML structure, let's walk through this component one bit at a time so you can understand exactly what's going on. So at the top, I've got my type definition because we're using TypeScript, and I'm defining my two custom properties, URL and API key. So if you want to use TypeScript and add in any custom properties yourself within the screen, you'll be adding some stuff in here. Now underneath here, I'm setting a hook. So using useState, combining it with this type definition, and I'm setting the API key and the URL as empty when the component loads. Now underneath here, we need to new up our app framework SDK. This time, because we're using the config screen, we need to use the config app SDK data types, and this is going to give us our SDK method. Now, just in terms of what we need to do for the app here, I'm using two basically main methods, three actually. So we've got the SDK.app get current state. Underneath here, you can see we've got SDK.app get parameters. And then if we look within this use effect, you can see that we've also got SDK app on configure. So this is going to be called when we click save. So this on configure method here is going to be calling this method that we've got here, which is doing a callback. So you can see that when we save stuff, we're going to get the current state and we're going to return it back. Simple. Now, the other thing we're doing is on initial load, you can see that we're getting our parameters. We're adding these to this current parameters object here, and then we're setting them to the state here. And then once this is ready, we know that all of our parameters here have been loaded in. We can do an app.setReady. So hopefully you can see there's a little bit of wiring up, mainly the getting the initial values, the listening into when those values are updated within the config screen, and then storing those values back into session. But that's pretty much all we need to do in order to set up this config screen. And then just to quickly wrap everything up, I've jumped us back into the field component here. And just to go over line 19 again, we're now doing sdk.parameters.installation. This is giving us access to those two properties that we've just looked at. And this is how we can access global state within any of the custom apps that we build within Contentful. So I'm hoping that you found this guide useful, and let me know in the comments if you struggled to set anything up correctly, or if you've got any ideas of any Contentful related videos you'd like me to make. Now, before we get going, don't forget to click on the like button and smash subscribe very, very gently, because I do a video every single week aimed at making you a better developer. Additionally, if you want to learn a little bit more about Contentful, I have created a book called Contentful, the Missing Manual, that goes over everything you need to know in order to start a new Contentful project. Finally, on the screen right now, you should see a link to a video called Contentful, setting up live preview without the hassle. So if you want to learn a little bit more, check that one out. Otherwise, until next Sunday, happy coding.